Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us. We're going to be tackling some pretty heavy philosophy today. Um, Immanuel Kant specifically.
Yeah, we're not messing around this time.
Definitely not. It's going to be a good one though.
Yeah.
So, our listener wants to really wrap their head around Kant's theory of the self.
And they're using Arthur Melnick's book to do it, which is ambitious, to say the least.
Yeah, I've heard that Melnick's book is not exactly beach reading.
It's dense. Let's just say that.
So thank goodness we've got you here to guide us through it. But before we even really crack open this book, can you give us the TL doctor, what makes Kant's view of the self so different? So interesting.
Well, Kant doesn't think the self is a thing.
Okay, wait, what?
Yeah. He doesn't think it's some kind of fixed entity,
Yeah.
like a table or a chair. He sees it more as an action.
The self is an action. All right, I'm intrigued. Break that down for me.
So instead of asking, what is the self, Kant's asking, what does the self do?
Okay, so how does that work? What does the self do according to Kant?
It's about this constant process of unifying our thoughts and experiences. Like our minds take in all this sensory information, right?
Yeah.
All these thoughts and feelings. And the self is the activity of pulling it all together, making sense of it all.
So it's not about WHO we are, but how we experience and process the world around us.
Exactly. And this has some pretty wild implications for, well, pretty much everything. How we see ourselves, our relationships, even like our place in the universe.
Okay, see, this is why I love deep dives. We start with the self and end up in the cosmos. It's a wild ride. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's stick with the basics for now.
Right back to Melnick.
Right. So this book, it's called, what is it? Name of book by Arthur Melnick on the topic of Kant's theory of self. It's broken down into 5 parts, right?
Yep, 5 parts. Each one dives into a different aspect of Kant's theory.
Sounds intense, but hey, a good challenge for a deep dive, right? And from what I hear, Melnick's writing is aimed at a pretty hardcore philosophy crowd.
To say the least. If Kant's ideas are the main course, Melnick's book is the chef's tasting menu. Multiple courses. Meticulously crafted. Definitely not for everyone.
So thank goodness we've got you to help us navigate. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, what's the main course Melnick's serving up? What's his big argument about Kant's view of the self?
Melnick wants to show us that Kant's view of the self is way more dynamic, way more interesting than traditional interpretations. See, we usually think of the self as this fixed thing. I'm me, you're simple as that.
Yeah.
But Kant throws that out the window.
Okay, let's unpack this. Instead of a fixed thing, how did Kant see the self?
Kant said the self is more like an action, an ongoing process, not a what, but a how.
We are verbs, not nouns. Okay, maybe that's simplifying it a bit.
It's a good place to start, because that's a huge shift in perspective. Instead of asking, what is the self, Kant's asking, what is the self do?
Mind blown already. But I have a feeling this is just the appetizer.
Oh, absolutely. To really get Kant, we need to ditch some common assumptions about what the self even means.
So what's the first misconception we're tossing out?
First up, we're tackling the idea that you can prove the soul exists just like any physical object like a table or chair. Kant disagreed with people who thought they could prove the soul was a real separate thing.
So if the self isn't a thing in that traditional sense, what is it? That's where this whole intellectual action idea comes in, right?
Exactly. Buckle up, because this is where things get really interesting.
All right, intellectual action. Lay it on me. How does that explain what the self is?
Well, it's not so much about defining what it is, but more about how it works, how it operates.
Okay, so how does it work?
Think of it this way. Your mind is always going right. Taking in all this information from your senses, your thoughts, your memories.
Sure.
And it's constantly trying to make sense of it all to unify it. That process, that's the self in action.
So it's not about WHO, I am, but
Yeah.
the way my mind is constantly working to process everything around me.
Exactly. And Melnick uses this great phrase. He calls it intellectual marshalling.
Intellectual marshalling. Okay, that sounds a little intense.
It's not as scary as it sounds. Imagine your mind is like a chef in a kitchen. You've got all these different ingredients,
Yeah.
sights, sounds, memories.
Okay, I'm following.
And the chef, your mind, takes those ingredients and combines them in this really specific way. That's how you get your own unique understanding of the world.
So it's like we're not just passively observing reality, we're actively creating our own experience of it.
Exactly. Our minds are taking this jumble of information and turning it into something coherent, something we can understand.
Wow, that's a lot to process. But it makes sense. I mean, we all experience the world differently, right?
Right. And this is where it gets really interesting. Because if the self is this process, it means it's always changing, always evolving.
So who I am is never really fixed. It's always in flux.
Think about it. Have you ever looked back at yourself from like 5 years ago and been like, who was that?
Oh, all the time. I mean, I hope I'm not the same person I was 5 years ago. That would be
Yeah,
considered.
we're always growing, changing, and our understanding of the self has to reflect that.
Okay, so we've covered how this relates to our own internal experience, but this has to have some pretty big implications for how we interact with the world, right? Like our relationships.
Absolutely. Think about something like love, for example.
Okay, love. Let's go there.
So for a lot of people, love is this thing you have or you don't.
Right.
You find the one, and that's it.
Sure, the fairy tale ending.
Right.
Yeah.
But Kant sees it differently. He'd say, love isn't a static thing. It's an action, an ongoing process.
So love is an intellectual action. I kind of like that.
It's about constantly building that connection, that understanding between two people. It's dynamic, not fixed.
That's actually a really beautiful way to think about
And
it.
it's super relevant today. Think about social media.
Oh boy, here we go.
Right. We're constantly curating these online versions of ourselves, trying to present this perfect image.
In comparing ourselves to everyone else's perfect images.
Exactly. But if the self is this fluid, evolving thing, are we doing ourselves a disservice by trying to fit into these static online identities?
It's like we're trapping ourselves in these digital cages.
In a way, yes. And that brings up a whole other set of questions.
Which I'm sure Melnick gets into.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
He doesn't shy away from the tough stuff.
Like what? Give me the cliff notes.
Well, if the self is always changing, what does that mean for things like personal identity, free will?
Okay, yeah, those are big questions.
Right. If who I am is constantly in flux, what makes me me from one day to the next? And if I'm always changing, am I really in control of my choices? Or is free will just an illusion?
Whoa. Okay, we went from zero to existential crisis pretty quickly there.
And we're just scratching the surface. Kant's view of the self has implications for how we understand the mind-body problem, the nature of reality, even morality.
So what you're saying is buckle up, because this is where things get really interesting.
Well, this is just the beginning.
So we're left with this idea that, like, the self is always changing, always evolving, but then what makes me over time? You know, like what holds it all together?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And honestly, Kant doesn't give us like a neat and tidy answer.
Yeah.
He's more interested in getting us to rethink the questions themselves, I think.
Right.
Like Melnick's book, it doesn't give us all the answers.
Okay, good. I was starting to feel a little overwhelmed.
But what it does do is lay out all these really challenging dilemmas,
Yeah.
right? Like if the self is always in flux, what does that mean for how we understand who we are, what we can even know about ourselves?
Right, right. And we've talked about free will, but there's got to be other, like, philosophical rabbit holes this leads to.
Right, tons.
Yeah.
Like what about the relationship between the mind and the body? If the self isn't just physical stuff, how do those two things connect? How do they work together?
And then there's the whole nature of reality thing. If our experience is constantly shaping how we see the world, does that mean there's no, like, objective truth?
Exactly. These are questions that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries. And Kant's view of the self, it just adds this whole other layer of complexity.
So this is why I love philosophy. It's like you pull on one thread and the whole universe starts to unravel.
It's a wild ride for sure. But it's also kind of empowering in a way, you know?
How so?
Well, if we accept that the self is this process, this constant state of becoming, it means we're not stuck.
Yeah.
We're not defined by some fixed, unchanging essence.
So you're saying there's always room for growth, for change.
Exactly. It's like we have the power to shape who we are every single day. And that's a pretty amazing thought, if you ask me.
It really is. It's like we're all works in progress, which honestly is kind of a relief, because if I was a finished product, I don't think I'd be very impressed with the results.
Well, luckily for us, none of us are finished products. We're all
But-
still becoming.
And on that note of becoming, I think we should probably wrap up this deep dive before things get too existential for a Wednesday afternoon.
You got it.
But seriously, this has been an incredible conversation. I always love diving into these big ideas with you.
Anytime. That's what we do.
So for our listeners, if you're feeling inspired to do some more philosophical soul searching, or maybe you just need a really strong cup of coffee after all that, we highly recommend checking out Melnick's book. It's a challenging read, but trust us, it's worth the effort.
It'll make you think about yourself and the world in a whole new light.
And that's what we're all about here at The Deep Dive, expanding those minds one episode at a time. So until next time, stay curious, everyone.